just to give you a little bit about my background, these are questions that I've been asking for upwards of 30 years or so. First of all at school, and then when I went to university, and it seemed like questions of belief were ones that were pretty important, particularly in an environment that wasn't very friendly towards those views. As I went through not only the university where I did science teaching, and then I taught for a year, but then I went and through university to study medicine, and then various other degrees and programs after that. But what I found was that within a secular marketplace of ideas, faith was not something that was necessarily encouraged or even thought of very highly. And so I certainly have grappled with those issues over several decades, and I'm sure many people here have done exactly the same. And the good news out of all that is that I think that there are some exceptionally good answers despite the fact of what might be put out there in the universities or in the media as well. And so I'm looking forward to this time over the next few sessions that we'll meet, because I think we'll deal with some of these really important questions in a way that hopefully is something that brings confidence to anyone who believes. Can an intelligent person believe in God? Well, many people think not. Many universities around the world have the presupposition that God does not exist and therefore God is not relevant to the study of any particular subject matter or curricula, unless of course it's some historical sense, some historical inquiry about the Christian faith, not as a living faith, but rather something that is an ancient historical study. So the question is, can an intelligent person believe in God? Well, before we really get into that specific question, we really need to define some terms. First of all, what type of God are we talking about? There are many different ideas of what God, who God is, or what God is like. There are some people who claim that there are millions of gods, many of gods out there. Some might say, there's only one God. Some say, of course, there's no God. Well, what type of God? Because many have been put off the whole idea of God because they think of God as being a harsh, vindictive, judgmental kind of character who, as Richard Dawkins suggests, is a most unpleasant character. And so, is this the type of God we're talking about? The type of God that many people have thrown away and said, look, we don't want to have anything to do with such a God. Well, no, I've got to say I don't believe in that type of God either. I am putting forward that there's a different type of God entirely, one which actually the Christian scriptures portray, a God who is kind, who is loving, a God who is interested in us, a God who wants the best for us for now and also the future, a God who is aware of the problems that we're going through, and a God who is looking to a time in history where things can actually be dealt with and there be a solution to humanity's problems. This is a God who I think is worthy of looking at and investigating, is there evidence that such a God exists? But see, this leads on to the next question. Well, why does it even matter? Is this just some academic discussion? Is this something that belongs in a philosophy or religion department in a university? Or is this something that actually has some practical relevance? Is this something that actually has some sort of meaning that it can present to any one of us? Well, I would suggest that the idea of God makes a huge difference in terms of the big questions of life. So who are we? What are we doing? What is our purpose? Where are we going? What's our destiny? These are the type of questions which not only are the big questions, but I think the question of God impacts greatly on how it affects each one of us. I remember when my daughter was very young, this was some years ago, and I remember standing there and just watching as she went to sleep. And many of you have had exactly the same experience, where you've got this young child who is just slowly drifting off to sleep and of course has an angelic look on her face. Now, of course, I'd like to say that she was angelic all the other times. Yes, she was most of the time. But particularly when she was going to sleep, there was just this look of, it was amazing beauty. And at that time, I couldn't help but think, it seems incredible that someone could argue that she just got here just as an accident of the universe. It seemed that there was a profound sense of, there is something significant here, there is something major. It's not just the random motion of atoms and molecules making up some sort of cells that make up a human being, but rather this is a living human being. This is somebody who loves, who receives love, who has a purpose. Surely there's something more to her life than the fact that she will grow up, she will live, and then she'll die, and that's the end. And to contemplate such a thing made me very sad. On the other hand, it struck me that there must be something which is more than what we just would ordinarily imagine if we just listen to the popular culture and media that we have around us. I think also of my parents. My father just turned 90 this year. And, thank God, he's still in good health. My mum, she's just a few years younger. She's 86. She's also in good health. Look, I guess by that age, there are certainly niggling issues and niggling problems medically. But I must say that overall, they're in good health, and I think that's fabulous. Look, they're great people, they're great parents, they have made a massive contribution to the world around them, not only to their family, but to the wider community. But, unfortunately, and it's very sad to think of, but we know that one day it may not be so that they will continue in the good health that they're in. There will come a time where the probability is that they will die. And that's a very sobering thought. But then the question is this, will I ever see them again? Because there's part of me, of course, that longs for the fact that death is not the end, but rather that I want to see them again. And I think that's a universal longing. And I think that's something that each person here can relate to. That if they have had a loved one who dies, that they will wonder if they will see that loved one again. And this is where the question of God is exceptionally relevant, because indeed if God exists and then further he promises a future where we can be reunited with our loved ones, well, that makes an enormous difference to our lives and makes the question of God exceedingly relevant. So the question we come back to, can an intelligent person believe in God? See, it's one thing to want to believe in a God such as this. It's another thing to consider, is there evidence that such a God exists? And that's what I want to have a look at this evening. We, of course, won't have time to go through multiple evidences. In fact, we will cover some other material in further sessions that will impact on this theme, because there will be other things that will also give us evidence for the existence of God. But there's just a few things which are critical ones which I want to share this evening. The first question, and I guess this is a fundamental question, is why is there anything at all? In fact, even before we ask where did the universe come from, why is there a universe? In fact, why is there anything? That's quite a profound question, and not one that we often think about, because we just assume that everything's here. But why? Because it's one thing to observe, it's another thing to ask the question, why? Where did things come from? But then the question, after we've grappled with that one and whatever answer we've come to, is where did the universe come from? I mean, the universe is just massive. Billions of light years across in dimension, with so many stars and galaxies, and of course we have this Earth with life which is amazingly complicated and complex on it. Now, when we look at the question of the origin of the universe, there are 4 logical possibilities. And to go through each one of the turn, they're like this. The first one is that there was an eternal nothing. And out of that eternal nothing, there developed matter, so the material a component of the universe, and also mind, so therefore the intelligence. So that's the first possibility, and in fact that's what many atheistic scientists would, in simplistic terms, hold to a view which is consistent with that first one. The second one is that there was eternal matter, and out of ever-existing eternal matter there came more matter and ultimately mind. Now this is a possibility that very few people would hold today. It was very popular maybe 50 years ago or longer ago, but it's been universally considered that that's not the case, and so most atheistic scientists would go with the first possibility, and the second one, as I mentioned, is largely out of favour. The third possibility, there's an eternal mind. Many people would give a label to this eternal mind as God. And so God was the one who then created or brought into being matter, so the universe, and then also intelligence and mind there as well. There is a fourth logical possibility, and that is that the whole thing's an illusion. There are some people who hold to such a view, but I'm not going to take it overly seriously because, look, as I've spoken to many people over the years, what seems to be very clear is that people's interaction with the universe tends to be very real, and particularly the pain and suffering that each person feels is something that we all experience, and it seems very much a reality, and too often a painful reality. So what we've really narrowed down then, of those four possibilities, we've got the first one and the third one. The first one, eternal nothing producing matter and mind, and the third one, eternal mind producing matter and mind. Now, when we consider those, what is likely to be more plausible? That out of absolutely nothing, there came the whole universe and intelligence and everything in it, or rather that there was a God who was existing from eternal, who brought matter and mind into being. Now, there's a lot we could talk about this. In fact, this is not a definite proof, obviously, that God exists. It's simply putting out there that when we look at it in the plainest terms, what is more plausible? To me, it seems more reasonable to believe that there was an eternal God who was existing, who brought everything into being, rather than from absolutely nothing, these develop spontaneously, and there's no particular rhyme or reason or cause. There is no explanation whatsoever. And when we look at the writings of the physicists and atheistic philosophers, there is an admission that there is no real comprehension or understanding of how it could possibly have happened, but it is considered that that is a fundamental presupposition that indeed it did. It came into being. And so this is where Francis Collins actually makes a very interesting comment. He says, I can't imagine how nature, in this case the universe, could have created itself. And the very fact that the universe had a beginning implies that someone was able to begin it. And it seems to me that had to be outside of nature. Now, Francis Collins, I'm sure most of you will know, was the director of the Human Genome Project. There was a race some years ago, about a decade or a decade and a half ago, to sequence the human DNA, to actually discover it, to unravel it, called the Human Genome Project. And Francis Collins was the head of that project. So certainly no one who was any dummy by any means, someone who was one of the most reputable and one of the most looked up to scientists in the world. And so as he has considered the universe, notice what he says. He's saying that it seems incredible, and in fact he's saying that that the cause of the universe had to be outside of nature. And when you look at further in the things that he wrote, he's very clearly talking about a creator God. Now at this stage, someone might say, and it's a good question, well, it's good to say, well, you know, you might say that God brought everything into being, but where did God come from? Who created God, or what caused God? I mean, fair enough question. How do we answer that? Well, in actual fact, it's an answer which isn't too difficult at all. Because, as the Oxford professor John Lennox said, nobody talks about the created God. There's no bestseller title, The Created God. God, by definition, always was. God was eternal. God was the first cause. God is the one who brought everything else into being. See, when we look at it in philosophical terms, there's no logical contradiction here at all. We simply posit that there is a being who always existed, who then brought everything else into being. See, in our experience, we seem to think that, well, everything that is needs to have had a cause. And so we know the law of cause and effect. And that's true. Every effect must have a cause. So if the universe comes into being, then it's an effect, which we need to rightfully look for a cause. So saying that it comes out of nothing doesn't explain a cause. But saying that the universe comes because an intelligent mind brought it into being is an explanation. But the point is, if we have a first cause, or we have what some would call the prime mover, or the uncaused cause, then that's not an effect. So God is not an effect of everything, but rather God is the first cause. And as Christians would believe, God is the first cause who is eternal, who always was. Now, there is no logical contradiction there. There is no philosophical issue with that. And I would suggest it's much more plausible to say that there is a God who was the first cause, who brought everything into being, than that it just developed out of nothing. It's interesting what the actual Holy Scriptures, the Christian Scriptures say. Look at this passage in Psalms 10, verses 1 to 3. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. So these were words written a very long time ago, more than 2,000 years ago. And they're basically saying that when you look at the universe, it's evidence there that God made them. God is the one who basically proclaims his works, and it proclaims what he's done. So that's the first thing we need to consider when we look at the existence of God. Well, look, where did the universe come from? Where did everything come from that we have? Now that leads into the second main point which I want to look at, and that is design. Now it's a little bit related to where the universe came from, but it is a little bit different as well. Because when we look at design, we're looking at how something is made, how it's arranged, the configuration of things, how it actually works, structure and function. And what's more, it then asks the question, where did this all come from? Now, there's a very famous analogy which goes back over 100 years, which is that of the watch and the watchmaker. So if someone, as the story goes, if someone stumbles across a watch in a forest and looks at it, then very clearly they would come to the conclusion someone made this and it just didn't happen to be there by accident or by itself. And when you look at the mechanism and look at the intricacy of the inside workings of a watch, I think it's very clear that we can come to that sort of conclusion just by looking at it. I think what's clear is that it is designed. It's not something that just happened to fall together. Now, when we look at the universe itself, there's some very interesting observations that we have of the universe. What we know is that the universe is incredibly fine-tuned in terms of its ability to even exist or sustain life. By that, we know that there are dozens and dozens of different parameters and different physical laws and constants that have to work together. Otherwise, it's not possible to have a universe or indeed have life on Earth. Now, we'll look at some examples of that. Those of you who have studied science have heard of physical constants. Now, one of those constants is the speed of light. There's many others as well. Now, what we know is out of these dozens and dozens of physical constants, if any one of them was to just be slightly different to what it actually is, then life could not exist in the universe. In fact, the universe couldn't exist. I'll give you an example. There's a particular ratio that is very important and very tight in terms of its potential deviation. There's the ratio of the electromagnetic force constant to the gravitational force constant. Now, if the ratio was only just ever so slightly different, the universe could not exist. Now, the actual figure is, if it deviated by 1 part with 10 to the power of 40, In other words, if there's only one part with 10 and that's got 40 zeros afterwards, we couldn't have a universe. Now, what's this number of, 10 with 40 zeros? Now, remembering that every time we add a zero to a number, we're multiplying by 10. If we had 2 zeros, we multiply by 100. This is just a massive number. Now, Paul Davies, who's the eminent physicist, actually illustrated it this way. He said it would be like, that type of accuracy would be like having a marksman or a shooter shoot a coin, not just in the next room, not just in the next suburb, not in another country, but to shoot it across the other side of the universe, 20 billion light years away, and hit the mark. That's the type of accuracy that we're talking about. There's another way of illustrating as well. Imagine that we chose a coin, let's say a 10-cent coin, and we then stack them up, one on top of the other. And we would go all the way from Earth, and let's say that we went all the way to the moon. No, but that's only the very start of it. Let's say that we then covered all of Australia with the 10-cent coin and then stacked all of them up all the way to the moon. Now, that's a lot of coins. What do you reckon? Now, let's say that we were to choose one coin, or put another way, let's say that we marked one of the coins and we painted it red. And somewhere in the mass of all those coins, somewhere in Australia, reaching all the way to the moon, just randomly there was a red painted coin that was somewhere somewhere in that pile. And then we had to be blindfolded and then somehow wade through all those coins. Let's imagine that we could do it somehow. And then just choose one at random, and it just happened to be that coin. Now, there's only one problem with that illustration. It underestimates it, because you don't only have one Australia going to the moon, you need 1 billion of them. You need 1 billion of them. And you've got one coin that's red in all those massive coins in 1 billion different Australias that are reaching to the moon. Now, that's how much a deviation you can tolerate. One part in 10 to the 40 is what, and you just deviate by that much and the universe can't exist. And that's just one ratio of physical contents, and there's dozens of them. Now, it's very interesting. As a result of this, many physicists, in fact, many scientists, have come to the conclusion that the odds are in fact incomprehensible for how this could possibly have happened by chance. And there's another theory which is there, many are then suggesting, well, maybe there is a thing called a multiverse. Now, I'm sure some of you have heard of the multiverse, and that is the idea that this universe isn't the only one that exists, but rather there is an infinite number of universes out there, and somewhere, just by chance, the conditions must have been just right so that life could have formed. First of all, there could have been a universe in the form that we can understand, but secondly, the conditions were right that life could have started on Earth. So this is the idea of the multiverse, because we just can't comprehend how a single universe could possibly have met those conditions. But the problem is this. Of course, there's no evidence for a multiverse. It's a theoretical construct. But this is the next point, that not only does it not really solve the problem, it actually complicates the problem, because all of a sudden we have to explain not only how one universe came into being spontaneously, but how an infinite number of universes came into being. So it's not that it actually helps solve the problem, it actually complicates it an infinite number of times. And so this is the whole question of what's called the fine-tuning argument of the universe and for the existence of God. It seems that there is some intelligence or something out there which has brought it all into being. Just happening by chance, it just doesn't seem plausible, or it just doesn't add up. Some people have tried to push it back. There is a theory saying, well, look, maybe it all came and it all happened, and all this design and universe is because aliens brought it here. Well, okay, that's fine, but they still need to exist within a universe, and what's more, it still pushes the problem further back, and where did the aliens come from, and how did that all develop? So it doesn't really solve the problem, it just actually pushes it back one step, but it still needs to be addressed and dealt with. Well, Paul Davies, who I mentioned before, he says, it seems as though someone has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. Now, this is, well, I guess it always pays to be prepared. Now, a mousetrap is something that we're no doubt familiar, hopefully not because you have to use it all that often. But there's something that we can say about the mousetrap, and that is that, in essence, it's a fairly simple structure. It's only got, maybe half a dozen different components, which, when they work in together, they do a job, and they, well, ideally, they catch the mouse that you're trying to catch that's causing problems. Well, the thing is that when we look at a mousetrap, if we were to take away any one particular part of the mousetrap, what will happen? It won't work. We need every one of those components, otherwise you don't really have a mousetrap. You've got something that might be, 3/4 of a mousetrap, it might be 80% of the mousetrap, but it's not going to actually do the job unless you have every bit there. When we look at the mousetrap, I think what's very clear is that it's designed. No one's going to argue that it wasn't somehow designed. And a design seems to suggest a designer. Well, let's have a look at some biological systems. And I think these are significant because, now these ones here which I'm going to show are examples of ones which are highly complicated, much more complex than the mousetrap. But if you were to take away just one small component of it, they wouldn't work. And the question is, what would be the purpose of 90 or 95% of it being somehow formed spontaneously, but the rest isn't there and it doesn't work? What these show is that there is clear evidence of design. Well, the first one is, now we don't really ever give much thought to a thing called the bacterial flagellum, like the tail bit of bacteria. We probably don't like to think about bacteria a whole lot, let alone the bacterial flagellum. Well, this is really, you've got an electron micrograph there, trying to look at one on the right, but then you've got the diagram of what one of these things looks like. Now, I've got to say that if I was an engineer, I'd be looking at that and thinking, look, I'd be pretty chuffed if I was able to design something like that. That's actually highly complex. Now, that's in a living system. It has, you can see there, it has a rotor which spins around hundreds of times a second. It has many hundreds of proteins and other substances which actually help to make the thing, which it's composed of. And then as it spins, it is able to then calculate, there's other parts of the bacteria which can actually gravitate towards certain things or certain parts or pathways where they want to go because it somehow needs to get to where it wants to go. Now, that's an incredibly complex structure. And the point is that if you were to take away, and you can just imagine with a motor, with that, if you were to take away just one or two of those components, the whole thing is going to become unstable and ultimately it would just break down. And then it's useless at all. So you've got to have hundreds and hundreds of different components all present at the same place at the same time to somehow make this thing work, otherwise the thing's useless. Clear evidence of design. Now, immunity. Immunity is one of those things that give medical students nightmares. I remember when we spent, it was only 1 week, we had an immunology block, an intensive, and they raced through everything and tried to teach us, I guess, what was known in those days about immunity. And look, all the students struggled to try to keep up with it and then try to memorise it for the exam. And then hopefully remember it, of course, after the exam to try to apply it. But you know what it's like with exams, sometimes you don't always remember it afterwards. But with immunity, you can see you've got so many different components that all interrelate, and they interact. And the problem is this, that if you take away one component, then you can't fight the disease or the pathogen that comes in, and it leads to the fact that people get severe diseases and ultimately will die if there is a problem with the immune system. Again, another one of those structures that is clearly designed, incredibly complex. What about the human eye? In fact, Charles Darwin himself said that the human eye was something that actually posed a serious difficulty for the theory that he was proposing. And it's not surprising why. Because how is it that an eye can come into being? Now, some have suggested, well, look, maybe there was a group of cells which, in a very simple organism, they just had some light receptors, they just had awareness of light and darkness. Well, that's all nice and well, but the point is, how does even that then biochemically go to the next step of somehow then becoming visually aware through to the brain, which isn't there even part of the diagram, have a whole lens that focuses, you've got the pupil that lets certain light in and not, then it focuses in on the retina, then you've got the light energy converted to electrical energy, which then is interpreted by the brain. I mean, even just memorising them, the labels is something that takes people a lot of time. You know, we do that in high school and much more detail in medical school. You know, it seems incomprehensible that something like this just comes into being by itself. It clearly points to a designer. Now, blood clotting is something that, again, we probably don't think about a whole lot unless there's a problem. Now, for blood to clot, there need to be 16 different proteins all present at the same place at the same time. And if one of them is missing, then you have a problem, because you don't clot, and if you cut yourself, you bleed to death. You've heard of haemophilia. And haemophilia is a defect in one or more of the clotting factors, these proteins, which actually lead to blood clotting. And that's the problem. Someone cuts themselves, they will bleed to death. On the other hand, we've got a problem that if we clot too much, well, what happens? We have heart attacks, we have strokes, and that causes a problem. So this is very finely tuned. 16 proteins. One missing, a problem. If they're too active, a problem. So think about it. They've got to be there all at the same time, at the same place, and in the right concentration. And what's the purpose of any of these proteins developing if you develop 15 of them and have one of them missing? Clear evidence of design. We take any component of it away and the system doesn't work. Motor car. Well, I don't think anyone would argue that a motor car isn't designed. But how many parts are there in a motor car? I had to look it up because obviously I'm not going to count it. And I found out that even going to the tiniest things, you know, the tiniest screws in the car and the tiniest components, there's about 30,000 parts in a car. Now that's pretty amazing, isn't it? 30,000 components in a car. So, you know, a car is something that we say is clearly designed. Now, here's another example of something that we look at and we say, well, that's designed. Well, what is that? Well, it's an artificial cockroach. Now, why would anyone build an artificial cockroach? Well, believe it or not, there were some engineers or scientists in the United States who decided they would build an artificial cockroach. I'm sure there were good reasons. I'm not sure what they are. But the artificial cockroach, well, what did it do? Look, it took them 18 months to get it to stand. And then it had to walk, and it was barely able to walk. Now, look, this was some years ago. I'm sure the technology has vastly improved, and it would be much faster now. But the thing is that it took a lot of intelligence to get this thing up and going. But tell me, do you reckon this thing can reproduce? Well, no. Can it eat? No. Well, can it run? Well, look, I'm sure it can in its own, fairly basic way. But look, these are some things that it can't do. Whereas, what do you reckon? One of these can? One of these, of course. Well, can they eat? Well, of course, they'll eat your kitchen out. Can they reproduce? Well, yeah. There's really no argument there that they can reproduce. Can they run? Well, that's the point. Half the time you can't even get near them because they duck. They're so fast. But the thing is, was this designed? Well, there's many people who say, well, no, it wasn't designed. It happened by accident. Well, hang on a minute. What are we dealing with? Are we dealing with evidence that it wasn't designed, or is this a presupposition? On the one hand, we've got the artificial one, which everyone says, yeah, well, that was clearly designed. Then we've got this one that has a lot more functionality and is a lot more complicated, but we're trying to say, well, hang on, it wasn't designed. See, what we're dealing here is not with evidence for and against, but as I say, it's a presupposition that certain things can or can't happen. Now, let's get to DNA, because DNA is absolutely fascinating. Remember how the motor car had 30,000 parts? Now, any guesses how many components there are in human DNA? Well, there's lots. There's 3 billion. So there's 3 billion subcomponents in human DNA, and we've only got 30,000 in a motor car, and I think that makes it even more graphic. We know that the complexity of DNA is enormous. What did it take? It took a whole team of researchers, a decade or so, to try to unravel the mysteries of the DNA. Whole teams of some of the most intelligent scientists in the world, and then they were finally able to work out what was there. And even now we're discovering a whole bunch of stuff. Now that's not to mention what we're learning now. There's a whole thing in medical science which isn't just DNA, it's the epigenome. So it's not just genetics, it's epigenetics. Now that is a whole field that we're only just trying to grapple with at the moment. So the complexity is hugely more enormous than what we might have even thought of 10 or 15 years ago. So when it comes to DNA though, it's just massive. There's an interesting academic in the second half of the 20th century. Some of you may have heard of his name. His name, Antony Flew. Antony Flew was one of the leading atheistic philosophers in the world. He published academically. He debated against believers. In fact, he would debate on university campuses all around Europe particularly, but around the world as well. And he was very firm in his conviction about atheism. He stunned the world in the year 2004 because he announced, it seems suddenly, that he'd changed his mind. Here he was, he'd spent decades of publishing in the top journals, some of the books that were widely cited, and here he was changing his mind. And of course people wanted to know why. Now of course there are various reasons, but he said the main one was that as he was debating into the 90s and then, in the turn of the century, that he became increasingly impressed by the sophistication of the design argument for the existence of God. And ultimately, the clincher was a DNA. He could not comprehend how there was any other way that human DNA could possibly have come into being than that it was actually designed by an intelligent mind, i.e. God. And this is actually what he says. Because he published a book, interestingly, where it actually has on the cover, "There is no God," the word "no" is crossed out, and the word "a" replaces it, so the title now reads, "There is a God." Note what he says. What I think the DNA material has done is that it has shown, by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinary diverse elements to work together. So the design argument, I think, is a very strong argument that points to a God who brought it all into being. There's another part, though, beyond design, which I'll just mention, and that is it's not just the physical that comes into being, but what about consciousness? What about our ability to be aware of our environment? Because if there's just simply atoms and molecules, then how is it that we have this awareness, this consciousness, we have memory, we have intentionality, and these are huge issues, not only philosophically, but in neuroscience as well. How can this be? Now it's interesting what J.B.S. Haldane actually said some years ago now. He said, "It seems to me immensely unlikely that mind is a mere byproduct of matter. For if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motion of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. They may be sound chemically, but that does not make them sound logically. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms." Interesting quotation. We don't have time to explore that topic in incredible detail, but it raises a whole issue of consciousness. Where did it come from? And it makes sense that if there is an intelligent mind, who is then obviously conscious, that brings the universe into being, then we as a result of that can have consciousness and intelligent mind. But if you simply have nothing and then you have a material world somehow come into being, how does that go into the next stage and produce mind and consciousness? I think it's an extraordinarily difficult argument to try to sustain. Now, there's another argument, I guess. Hang on, this one here in the book of Psalms, it actually says very clearly, "Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvellous. How well I know it." And that's it. And that's what the Christian scriptures are saying, that we are incredibly made. We're wonderfully complex. And we can see this as we just look at the scientific understandings we have now, much more than we had even decades ago. Now, there's another, I think, important point I want to touch on, and that is the existence of morals. How is it that we know what is right and wrong? How do we determine what is right and wrong? How do we determine what is good and evil? Now, on the one hand, we might think, well, look, they're fairly basic questions, aren't they? Well, don't we all know what is right and wrong, good and evil? Well, hang on a minute. When you have different cultures and different societies and groups who have different ideas, they will sometimes come into conflict. So then, how does someone decide what is right and wrong? Now, we have a theory called social contract, which we learn about in sociology, etc. And the idea is, well, look, we will do something because it ultimately benefits us and our group, and we will work out what the right ways are to interact with people, because ultimately it's for our own benefit and our DNA's benefit that we want to pass on. Well, fine, okay, well, look, that might be one partial way that we can look at it, but it doesn't really solve the problem. Because when you look at a model which is atheistic and macroevolutionary in its outlook, one of the central tenets of it is survival of the fittest. Now, if you have survival of the fittest, well, then what we should expect is a particular struggle, and pain and suffering will be, unfortunately, a byproduct of that. Now, social Darwinism is something that we saw in evidence through, I guess, various cultures over the last 100 years, different societies who maybe tried to implement it. And the question I would ask is this: what if Hitler had won World War II? Would that have made him right? And people will say, well, no. Well, I mean, what Hitler did was terrible. He killed millions of people and he exterminated minorities and various ethnic groups, etc., etc. That can't be. Well, that's interesting. But, and I don't disagree. Of course it's a tragedy, it was terrible. But on what basis do we judge him? We talk about good and evil, we talk about right and wrong. But ultimately, if might is right and if it's survival of the fittest, then on what basis can we condemn Hitler? Now, of course, the fact that he lost, the winners can make that judgment, but this is the question: what if he had won? What if his idea of the superiority of the Aryan race had come through, and he had then gone on and made various affiliations and conquered the world, and it was a different place? Then how would this whole topic have been judged? And this is some of the difficulty of how it is that we determine right and wrong. Is there an objective measure, or is it something that we determine because it suits our best interests, or it's convenient, or we think that it's most comfortable to do it that way? Now, there was a Russian writer who many of you heard of by the name of Dostoevsky, who says something rather profound. He made the comment, he said, without God, all things are permissible. Now, it's really interesting to look at that and unpack that. But what he's really saying is that without an external source of morality, of right and wrong, ultimately it's very difficult to have a standard that one human will have to judge another human, because who is going to arbitrate and who's going to determine what is right and wrong? And this is where many people have looked at the idea of morality and concluded there indeed must be a God, because otherwise how would we be able to, from a human perspective, work out morality? And the argument is that for humans to have an objective morality, there needs to be someone outside of humanity who is able to actually provide those details, or to let humanity know indeed what is right and wrong and what are the various bases of morality. Now, at this stage, there are many other things that we could say about arguments that have been used for the existence of God. And some of these go anywhere from the existence of beauty to the existence of beautiful music or art. Others will look at the whole idea of meaning and purpose, looking at a more existential level. There's others that will look at Jesus Christ. In fact, we'll explore some of the themes from a Christian perspective. Who was Jesus Christ? Was he indeed God? Did he rise from the dead? Is there any such historical evidence that such a thing could have happened? These are some of the questions that can come up. In actual fact, there are many other lines of evidence that we can look at that we will explore tomorrow and also in a fortnight's time. But when it comes back to the original question, can an intelligent person believe in God? I think the answer is overwhelmingly yes. In fact, I would go even further and say not only is the answer yes, but as we unpack some of the different lines of evidence, I think the evidence is compelling. And as we'll explore in the next few sessions, it's not just a God who is disinterested in us, but rather there is a God who loves us, who wants the best for us, and he actually has a wonderful future prepared for anybody who wants to share that future with him. Thank you.